Good afternoon, Governor, Senior Deputy Governor, Deputy Governors, members of the Monetary Board, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me thank the Central Bank for the invitation to deliver this 69th anniversary oration, and I'd like to thank the Governor in particular for this invitation. I see many familiar faces in the room. I, along with many of them, was very pleased when Dr. Coomaraswamy was appointed governor, now two and a half years ago. I thought he was, and I think he remains, by far the best person for the job. In terms of qualifications, expertise, and, as important, temperament. He has a reputation for being so ramrod straight in his probity and in his being utterly dedicated to public service. I have joked with some friends, some of them are in the audience, that Dr. Coomaraswamy is the only Sri Lankan I know who not only has not a bad word to say about anyone in public, but also doesn't have a bad word to say about anyone in private. Now, in Sri Lanka, of all places, that must be unique. When Dr. Coomaraswamy took the governorship, I think he faced three great challenges. One was to make the central bank again play a positive role to contribute to macroeconomic stability rather than reinforce the excesses of populist fiscal policy. The second, of course, was to restore the good name of the central bank after the bond auction scandals. And third, perhaps a more medium-term proposition, was to restore the integrity and professionalism of the central bank after perhaps a decade of unprecedented politicization. Now, those challenges remain unfinished business, invariably so in Sri Lanka's noxious political climate. And of course, I wish Dr. Coomaraswamy and his colleagues the best in achieving those objectives, and I think he was quite right to spend the time he did arguing the case for the new monetary law in that context. Now, when I was asked to give this oration, I was initially asked to give a lecture on monetary policy, and I assume that most previous lecturers have talked about monetary policy. I declined politely, pleading ignorance, because I am not a monetary policy expert. So rather what I proposed was to give a wider-ranging talk on the link between political economy and economic policy in our times. It's something I've thought about a lot as an academic over almost 30 years now, and it's also something I've thought about more recently as a failed policy advisor to the government of Sri Lanka. So that will be the subject of my talk. Now, before I get into the substance, let me clarify what I mean by political economy. As I've told my students at the beginning of every academic year for almost 30 years now, far too long, at its simplest, it is about the link between politics and economics, between the state and the market, between the realm of wealth and the realm of power. And that is indeed what Adam Smith meant by political economy, that link between politics and economics, wealth and power, state and market, and how all of that combines to produce the wealth of nations, the title of his famous book. In the next generation after Adam Smith, two great English economists had an exchange of letters. And there's in a letter from Malthus to Ricardo, Malthus writes of the causes of the wealth and poverty of nations, the grandest of all inquiries in political economy. Now, more specifically, what I mean by political economy are about 4 or 5 big things. So firstly, the historical legacy, including the legacy of factor endowments and institutions, what economists like to call initial conditions, which set constraints and opportunities, paths for development, as it were. Secondly, the role of interest groups, of organized interests, how they contest each other, how they collaborate, how they interact with the state. There's a quote from John Stuart Mill, "A good cause seldom triumphs without an interest behind it." Of course, we know that a bad cause seldom triumphs without some powerful interest behind it. Thirdly, the role of ideas, often underplayed in political economy. There's another famous quote from Lord Keynes: "Madmen who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy," from the words of some academic scribbler or defunct economist of a few years back. Madmen who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy. Keynes was thinking about Adolf Hitler in the 1930s. Some of you may be thinking of a few of your least favorite politicians who will remain tantalizingly nameless, but you take your pick. Thirdly, the role of institutions and how they frame decision-making in particular places and particular times. Fourthly, again sometimes underestimated, the role of events, situations. And I'm thinking particularly of crises and how crises really are the backdrop to big changes in policy, economic policy reform. And that's something I'm going to return to in a moment. In recent decades, we've also appreciated much more the link between what is domestic and what is international in economic policy, not least because economic globalization, other forms of globalization like modern communications, have blurred that domestic-international divide. And finally, very broadly, we have to think of the broad frame of geopolitics, international security issues, the grand questions of war and peace, and how they affect economic policy and economic performance. So in a very broad terms, that's what I mean by political economy. Now, I'm going to talk first about that link between political economy and economic policy on a global and Asian canvas, and then talk, as I come to my conclusion, about Sri Lanka. But before doing that, let me state, I am an unapologetic classical liberal in the tradition all the way from Adam Smith and David Hume to Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek in the 20th century. And a classical liberal, above all, puts emphasis on the freedom of the individual and makes the link between individual freedom and prosperity and well-being. And the enabling conditions for that are, as far as practically possible, a limited but strong government, certainly not a minimal government, free-ish markets, free trade abroad, peaceful international relations, the rule of law, and free, open societies. Classical liberals in Sri Lanka and elsewhere are pejoratively dismissed as neoliberals and market fundamentalists, heartless and bloodless, but that's another story. So let me try and paint on that global and Asian canvas in terms of that link of political economy and economic policy, and then see what's relevant there for Sri Lanka. And I return to this notion of crisis, because crisis is more often than not a turning point for economic policy and economic performance. Crises are neat bookends that divide eras of economic policy and economic performance. I'm thinking, of course, of various types of economic crisis. Balance of payments crisis, an external default, a domestic banking crisis, domestic default, high chronic inflation, currency crashes. These are all types of economic crises, and often they're interrelated, as we see with what's very sadly unfolding again in Argentina today. But more often than not, an economic crisis is twinned with a political crisis, with severe stress on political systems, sometimes even threatening the collapse of the state itself. But in that context, a crisis is also an opportunity or window of opportunity for reform. And I'm going to pick one example here, and it also comes from my reading of one book. The author is Professor Leszek Balcerowicz, who was finance minister and later central bank governor of Poland, the architect of Poland's economic reforms from 1989. And the book is called Capitalism, Socialism, Transformation. Now, Dr. Balcerowicz was a professor before he became Minister of Finance, but he was writing very much about his experience as finance minister. Now, when he took the reins of the Ministry of Finance in the last half of 1989, Poland was in economic freefall. It was collapsing politically and socially as well. So a real crisis, political and economic. And he reckoned he had about 6 months, a window of opportunity to push through some really big reforms in an atmosphere, as he calls it, of extraordinary politics, when normal politics was suspended because of the crisis. And he succeeded. Poland is one of the stellar performers of the post-Soviet economies, because he pushed through a critical mass of reforms in that period of extraordinary politics, which provided a sort of bridgehead to more incremental reforms when normal politics returned. So the reforms were locked in, difficult to reverse, and then they gradually moved forward through the 90s. But what was key to that was the crisis. Now, I'm going to use that as a lens for talking about what's happened before the global financial crisis itself, and what's happened after the global financial crisis to the present. And I'll start a little historical tour with the Great Depression, which was, of course, a really big economic and political crisis, and the kind of policies it set in place for the following 40 years until the 1970s. So what we saw with the Great Depression, that crisis, in the West and elsewhere, was a pendular swing away from the market to the state. The state intervened in countries rich and poor, colonized as well as independent, outside the West, to much greater intervention. Of course, that unfolded in macroeconomic policy with the Keynesian revolution. There was much more financial regulation. Welfare states expanded, especially after the Second World War. But that also translated into much more state intervention in international relations, including protectionism, currency devaluation, foreign exchange controls, throttling capital flows, and so on, all of which, of course, provided some sort of backdrop for much more unstable international relations leading up to the Second World War. Post-1945, in the West, what we saw was a new kind of balance, what is sometimes dubbed Smith abroad and Keynes at home. So that expanded space for the state continued after the Second World War, but Western governments subscribed to new international rules, the Bretton Woods system on exchange rates, and more durably, international trade rules in the GATT, to essentially tie their hands, to impose discipline on themselves collectively, so that freer international trade could resume. And that was the post-war compromise. Let's not forget that the enabling environment for that was American leadership in a new Pax Americana, both security leadership, providing a military blanket for allies, and economic leadership, not least in initiating and organizing cooperation among states in the GATT, in the Bretton Woods system, to provide those essential public goods for a combination of stability and openness. 80% of the world's population lived in so-called second and so-called third world countries that pursued a very different path. The Soviet economies, the command economies, sealed themselves off from the world, and the so-called third world, led by countries like India and Brazil, pursued policies of high mercantilism, also effectively cutting themselves off from the rest of the world economically. Now, the next set of crises that really matter were in the 1970s and 1980s. So we had stagflation in the West, we had the Vietnam War causing a crisis of confidence in the United States. We had the bankruptcy of many of those policies followed in the third world, not least in countries like India and Brazil. And then in the 1980s, the Latin American debt crisis and the implosion towards the end of the 80s of the Soviet economies. So another big backdrop of crisis, which this time made the pendulum swing back to the market from the state. We saw continued liberalization in the West, the Reagan Revolution in the States, the Thatcher Revolution in the UK, the single market program of the European Union. But much more importantly, we saw the countries of the second world and the third world, representing about 80% of the world's population, liberalize and globalize very radically over a period of 2 decades or so in what came to be called the Washington Consensus. And that ushered in an era of unprecedented economic globalization. World trade grew twice as fast as GDP growth, at about 7%. World trade, which was about 40% of GDP in the mid-1980s, was up to about 60% by 2007. Foreign direct investment multiplied 28-fold. This was an era of new global value chains, revolutionizing international production, bringing industrial revolutions to many parts of the non-Western world, especially in Asia. And again, in a global climate of the Pax Americana, with American leadership, not just in security issues, but also on the key economic issues, with America continuing to take the lead in organizing international cooperation. So that brings me to the global financial crisis and its aftermath. What we saw with the GFC was a financial crisis in the West, which then spread to the rest of the world in terms of a trade shock and caused depression, a contraction of output, employment, trade, and growth. The recovery, as we've seen over the last 12 years now, 11 years, has been very differential. Anemic growth in the West, some parts of which are still suffering from the after effects of a deep financial crisis, notably in Europe and with European banks. And a quicker, faster recovery, a healthier rebound in other parts of the world which didn't suffer from a financial crisis, particularly in Asia. But overall, the climate, particularly in the last few years, has been one of a global growth slowdown, certainly compared with the pre-GFC years, and a prolonged productivity slowdown in the West as well as outside the West. And in this context, what we've seen is a transition from the kind of economic globalization I very briefly described before the GFC to what the Economist newspaper calls slowbalization today, meaning globalization essentially stalling, reversing at the margin, but not significantly. So, for example, trade seems to be stuck around 60% of GDP, a little less. We are seeing early signs of the contraction of global value chains, particularly through the flow of intermediate industrial imports. Foreign direct investment, 3.5% of world GDP in 2007. Foreign FDI flows are now about 1.5% of GDP. We've seen very significant financial deglobalization through the contraction of cross-border capital flows. So those are the symptoms of what we've seen since the crisis. And what I want to really concentrate on now are, if you like, the really big political economy implications of this and the link between political economy and economic policy. What we've seen with the GFC and subsequently is another pendular shift. So this time from the market to the state, going in the reverse direction to what we saw in that quarter century or so before the global financial crisis. And it is pervasive. So we see it in the first instance in macroeconomic policy, a massive increase in state intervention, in fiscal policy immediately after the crisis, but more durably in monetary policy, particularly with the leading central banks, the ECB, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, essentially tripling their balance sheets, accounting for almost 40% of their GDPs now. And that, of course, is an epochal shift, because in monetary policy, we now see central banks essentially bursting that barrier with fiscal policy and central bankers wading deep into fiscal policy territory. It goes beyond macroeconomic policy. There's much more financial regulation around the world, some of it perhaps necessary. We see much more industrial policy intervention. But we also see this new domestic state activism spilling over the border into international relations. So in the decade after the GFC, we saw what came to be called creeping protectionism, particularly on non-tariff barriers, an emerging investment nationalism, for example, revoking or turning away from bilateral investment treaties, and indeed new restrictions on immigration, and an increasing bending of international rules, particularly trade rules, the WTO getting progressively weaker. So that's the pendular shift. And in that context, I want to point to two styles of shift from the market to the state, which I think have repercussions that will last for some time. And they're related. The first is an increasing and now entrenched bias to short-termism in economic policy. And when I think about this, I think about, it's a classic essay. I must have read it 20 or 30 years ago. It's by the great Canadian economist Jacob Viner. And Viner, who taught first at Chicago and then at Princeton, was perhaps one of the three great historians of economic thought, along with Joseph Schumpeter and Lionel Robbins. The essay is called The Long View and the Short, written in the 1950s. And in it, Viner contrasts two styles of economic policy. So one, very much influenced by the classical economists, is setting policy in as simple, non-complex, consistent and predictable terms as possible for the long term, because that's the best enabling framework for sustainable growth, as it were. And he contrasts that with the Keynesian revolution of the 1930s, because, as Lord Keynes, of course, laid out, his prescriptions were intended to deal with an unprecedented crisis with extraordinary measures, but were intended for the short term. Fiscal policy in particular. Now, Viner's main point in this essay is that what was initially a short-term response to extraordinary conditions essentially became long-term policy. And he found that potentially very damaging. In other words, the short term comes to replace the long term in economic policy for the long term. Now, let me use that lens to look at or interpret what I think is an entrenched short-term bias in economic policy since the global financial crisis. So initially, of course, with fiscal stimulus and then with monetary policy, not least quantitative easing, these were intended as short-term measures, but it is becoming increasingly evident that on the monetary policy side in particular, what was intended for the short term is essentially becoming medium term and long term. And it's very difficult to get out of it. As a fiscal conservative, I would say that I find continued calls for fiscal stimulus in an atmosphere, in an environment where public debt to GDP levels in the West are over 100%, not particularly advisable. But generally, I'm worried about this bias of short-term policy making seemingly into our long-term future. For I think it's worrying in terms of short-term and long-term economic distortions, not least with quantitative easing policies. It's worrying because it gives, in my view, too much discretion to politicians and bureaucrats, including central bankers, to intervene in all sorts of ways. And it sends powerful signals to political and economic actors to behave in ways that might well be against the public interest. So that's one shift. The second shift, related to the first, is a bias in favor of increasing discretion in policy and less rules. So it's a rules versus discretion argument, which has also played its part in economic policy debates in different eras. Now, again, going back to that long view of the classical economists, which Professor Weiner wrote about, the classical economists believed that rule-bound policy was the best policy for the long term. In other words, economic policies, fiscal policy, monetary policy, international trade, for example, were best served by having rules that put limits on political and executive discretion for long-term stability and predictability. And if you look at eras of economic policy in the 19th century, Joseph Schumpeter called the 19th century a century with a system of economic liberalism. There was Gladstonian public finance, and the informal rule was balanced budgets, with fiscal policy attempting not to interfere too much in the microeconomy. The gold standard, as fixed a rule as one could get, with quasi-automatic adjustment. Having the border fully open to international trade. Respecting in domestic and international law the non-discriminatory rights of foreigners to own and contract property, and so on. So those were international and domestic rules in the 19th century, smashed to smithereens in the first half of the 20th century, when discretion ran amok domestically and most poisonously internationally in an era of deglobalization and then depression and then, of course, a war. After 1945, we saw a sort of balance in the West, discretion prevailing in domestic policy, but more rules, particularly to further international trade through the GATT and then what became the WTO. And in that era of unprecedented liberalization and globalization, post-1980 roughly, we saw a sort of partial return to rules. For example, rules of fiscal procedure, starting with innovations in countries like Australia and New Zealand, and of course stronger international trade rules in the WTO, as part of that shift back to the market, if you like. Now, what we have seen during and after the global financial crisis is, I think, another reversal. And a reversal in favor of much more discretion in macro and microeconomic policy, spilling over into more discretion in international economic relations, which puts seemingly unbearable stress these days on trade rules in particular. So we have a kind of echo of the 1970s now, where a combination of more intervention and discretion domestically spills over the border into more unsettled international economic relations. Now, I'm going to labor this point a little bit because I think these big shifts, that pendular swing from the market to the state, accompanied by short-term bias and more discretion and rules that are flouted, weakened more. Underlying all this, I think, is a misguided worldview. It's a worldview that Lord Keynes and his Bloomsbury Circle had, and Hayek accused Keynes and his ilk of suffering from a fatal conceit for that very reason. Why is this worldview misguided? Maybe I'm being a bit polemical here. Maybe I'm exaggerating slightly for effect. It's not the first time I've done that. But let me paint this worldview. And it was very much, I think, the underlying view of someone like Lord Keynes, indeed Keynes himself. I think of it in modern times also as a kind of Davos view of the world. It's as if you could get a committee of really good, super qualified, intelligent people together who are Platonic guardians, as it were, who only have the public interest in mind. They're the best committee to essentially sort out the complex problems of the world because they know best. They also assume that they have the requisite knowledge to intervene here, there, and everywhere, superior to the market in particular situations. Let me choose a generic example, and this happens around the world, sometimes also here in Sri Lanka. The generic example is of, say, a monetary board of a central bank that actually tells market actors, beginning with commercial banks, what interest rates they should charge, to whom they should lend, under what conditions. And when these market actors don't behave accordingly, well, they're ticked off as naughty schoolchildren, and sometimes threatened with punitive action. Now, I think that kind of behavior is the behavior of the People's Bank of China, appropriately so, because China has a virtual command economy in its financial system. But in a market economy, I don't think that's appropriate, and I think it fundamentally misunderstands what a market economy is about. Not least because it assumes that, if you like, a certain committee of good men have better interests and knowledge. And I think in a market economy, when it comes to things like how prices are formed and even how interest rates are formed, all of us are constitutionally ignorant, as Hayek said. And we form common knowledge through the interactions of the market spontaneously through decentralized transactions. So I'm rather worried about this kind of bias, this kind of worldview around the world. And as a classical liberal, I would much rather have institutions, as David Hume once famously put it, under which bad men do least harm, namely institutions with inbuilt checks and balances. And that was the infusing spirit of James Madison and Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers, and, of course, the infusing spirit of the US Constitution. Rather than institutions that rely on good men who are supposed to be completely public-spirited. I think that's perhaps a better understanding of human nature. And that's certainly something I glean from the Scottish Enlightenment rather than the French Enlightenment. Now, let me end this painting of the global canvas by talking about the present and speculating a little bit about the future. I think that probably since the beginning of last year, we have entered a new mercantilist era of the world economy. The climate remains the same from the global financial crisis in two respects: a global growth slowdown and a global productivity slowdown. But it is different from what happened even 2 years ago in other respects. The story starts with an anti-globalization backlash in the West for all sorts of complex reasons. One of them being 20% of global manufacturing shifting from west to the rest or from north to south from 1990 to about 2015. So you have that backlash in certain pockets. Technology revolutions with a bias to those with education and skills, and all sorts of social and economic and cultural reasons as well. But it has led to a climate of populism, which certain populists in Europe and in the United States have exploited. President Trump, of course, in the lead. And as we know, President Trump has triggered a trade war with China on 3 fronts now: tariffs, non-tariff barriers revolving around a new technology war, and most recently, essentially weaponizing the US dollar in financial clearing operations and in currency transactions. But we also see a corresponding mercantilism coming from China under President Xi Jinping, much more state intervention domestically and a much more potent mercantilism externally. And Sri Lanka is one of those countries on the receiving end of that. The global environment led by the United States is of policy making that's much more erratic, much less predictable, much more impulsive, and with a corresponding weakening of international institutions. I think we see that weakening in the bank, in the fund, and perhaps in terms of the biggest existential threat to the WTO itself. A new mercantilist era, because everything I've described so far, coming from the Americans and the Chinese in the first instance, is not about multilateral rules and rule discipline. It's very much about the exercise of power in bilateral transactions. In other words, you opt to deal bilaterally and evade the multilateral route, and you exert your power over the less powerful. We see the Americans doing that for the moment. We see the Chinese doing that systematically through the Belt and Road Initiative and through essentially trying to create a 21st century version of a tributary system, which includes Sri Lanka. Now, I worry about this new mercantilist era because if it remains unchecked, then I think it might well presage a new era of deglobalization. Significant one which we haven't seen so far. And if we see a new era of deglobalization, that will put further downward pressure on growth, on productivity, further lowering our longer-term growth potential. It will mean there will be smaller cakes, or cakes not going fast enough in domestic polities and societies, leading to more conflict. And that will spill over into more noxious international relations. Now, that is a 1930s scenario. We are very far away from that still, but I think it's worrying that we seem to be beginning to head in that direction. Now, Asia is the crucible of all these trends, more so than ever before. If we think of the spectacularly successful previous 50 or 60 years of Asia, particularly East Asia, but then spreading to South Asia. Spectacular in its catch-up growth, and with an enabling environment of globalization and the Pax Americana. I think those were crucial. But if we look forward, I think we should certainly beware of linear extrapolation, because to begin with, the growth challenges in Asia of the future are much, much more complex than the, with hindsight, simpler catch-up growth of previous decades. There's still plenty of Asia with huge catch-up growth. That's poor Asia. But if we look at Middle Asia, if you like, and rich Asia, we see countries that really need to improve their productivity-led growth much more, move more to innovation systems. That demands much more of political systems, economic regulation, institutions in the round. And all of that, these challenges are now coming together at a time when the external environment is turning for the worse. So I think the challenges around Asia, including Sri Lanka, also inching somewhat closer to the frontier, as it were, of catch-up growth, are much more challenging, much more difficult, and that puts more challenge and stress on political systems as well. Let me now move from that global canvas and Asian canvas to some observations on Sri Lanka and how it fits in that broad context. From independence to 1977, of course, we saw a big pendulous swing to the state from the market, a big expansion of the state, more restrictions on markets, particularly between 1956 and 1965, and then even more so between 1970 and 1977. Sri Lanka followed the Indian Nehru-Gandhi route of high mercantilism and not that more pragmatic East Asian route of export-oriented industrialization. It missed the boat of the opening of Western markets during that era. And many things became much more politicized, particularly in the 1970s. Now, I just want to pick another policy and institutional example from this era. It's not necessarily the most important one, but it does relate to central banking. And of course, it's the story of the old currency board and how that morphed into central banking here in Sri Lanka, which is a familiar story to many, many here. But I want to frame that story very much in the context of rules versus discretion that I talked about earlier. So Ceylon, at independence, inherited a currency board from the British, in common with other colonies that got independence. And then in 1950, what was essentially a pretty strict rule regime to limit political and bureaucratic discretion, a currency board, very roughly equivalent to a fixed and non-adjustable peg. That was transformed in 1950 thanks to the design and then the tutelage of John Exter, and let's not forget, under a UNP government with J.R. Jayawardena as finance minister, into discretionary central banking. And since then, we've had at least some periods where monetary policy, with discretion more than rules, has reinforced the mistakes of fiscal policy rather than leaning against that wind, as it were. And seen in that light, there may well be one journalist in this audience who seems to tell this story every week. I agree with him in one respect, I think. I think that move away from the currency board to discretionary central banking was perhaps one of independent Ceylon's early birth defects, in light of what's happened subsequently. That said, something as strictly rule-oriented as a currency board cannot be seen in isolation. I mean, this is where the political economy is really important. If we look at the record of successful currency boards, both historically and in more recent times, for example, the Hong Kong currency board since 1983, I think it is, the currency boards of the Baltic states in the 1990s, which I had some experience of in that part of the world, they worked because that rule discipline in monetary policy and exchange rate policy had a corresponding rule discipline in fiscal policy, and, if you like, a generalized consensus among the elite, underpinned by popular legitimacy, not to tamper with independent institutions and to privilege rules over discretion. A currency board on its own, as the Argentine experience in the 1990s shows us, does not work if fiscal policy is going in the opposite direction and politics in general is going in the opposite direction. So in that light, I think it was probably only a matter of time that the currency board failed, given what happened in Ceylon and then Sri Lanka through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and onwards. And I don't think it's a panacea today. There are technical reasons why it can't be introduced. But still, I would make the argument, and I think the governor made a very powerful argument in his preliminary remarks, for more rules in the system to insulate against political discretion, fiscal policy discretion in particular. And in that light, I would fully concur that the new monetary law should be passed, and preferably before elections, where Sri Lankan noxious politics will be displayed at its worst. Okay, 1977, back to crisis. The election of 1977, of course, presaged a new government undertaking the most radical market opening reforms this country has seen. So a pendular swing again, this time to the market. And the only example I can think of where crisis in Sri Lanka has actually led to successful policy reform. Since then, until about 2005, we saw liberalization in fits and starts, sometimes derailed by incontinent fiscal policy. My friend Sarath Rajapatirana, I don't know if he's here, has written about that extensively. And of course, under the thick pall of a 25-year civil war. From 2005, 2006 to 2015, Sri Lanka, under Mahinda Chintana, entered a period of deliberalization. Again, this time a pendular swing from the market to the state, in the context of illiberal democracy, a rather chauvinist ethnic agenda, a combination of crony capitalism and crony socialism, highly centralized, and a foreign policy tilting very strongly to China and against India and the West. Which brings me to the change of government in January 2015 and what's happened since then. It wasn't an economic crisis in the classic sense, but it was nevertheless, I think, a once-in-a-generation window of opportunity for a combination of liberal and economic reform in Sri Lanka, probably the best since 1977. And Ranil Wickremesinghe certainly thought of it that way, and he and other senior UNP politicians in particular have intermittently paid lip service to it since. On the political front, we've seen modest successes, and I suspect those successes are not major enough not to be reversed in the near future. I have my worries about that. On the economic front, it failed comprehensively. We've had some modest success with macroeconomic stabilization, not least to correct the excesses of the present government as well as the excesses of the last government. But I wonder whether that will hold into the medium term. I have my doubts about that as well. Let me now share with you just a couple of observations on my 3 years' experience, as I said at the beginning of my talk, as a failed policy advisor to the government of Sri Lanka. And I have two main sets of observations. The first is that this government came into power with almost wholly devoid of talent and expertise, quite in contrast to the economic team that was put in place in or soon after July 1977. The LTTE and the JVP in combination did a spectacular job at destroying the best of Sri Lanka's political elite. And the new government also came into power without an economic plan, and it never developed one. What it eventually came up with was two things. Firstly, a Christmas tree wish list of things that were going to happen by 2025. And secondly, rhetorical nonsense about a Sri Lankan takeoff and Sri Lanka becoming the next Singapore, which I consider to be Orwellian duck speak. In George Orwell's 1984, one of the terms of newspeak is duck speak. Duck speak is when the vocal cords and the way they're exercised are completely divorced from other bodily and external reality. A case, as it were, I'm borrowing here from a John le Carré spy novel, a case, as it were, of castration from the neck upwards. The second major observation I have to make, and it's difficult to think of an answer for this one, was observing somewhat close up the dire state of the Sri Lankan state, or in the academic jargon, a serious lack of state capacity. And I came to the conclusion quite quickly that even fairly simple reforms were difficult and perhaps in some cases almost impossible to push through because of the dysfunction of the Sri Lankan state. It's not a Sri Lankan exception. You find echoes of this in other parts of the world as well. But, and this is a very complex set of problems, but let me just, by way of example, point to something very simple. The utter shambles of high-level meetings in government ministries, some of which I attended, where they invariably start late, they end late, there is hardly a coherent agenda, there are 5 or 6 different people talking at the same time, veering off in 5 or 6 different directions, everybody talking, nobody listening, no one taking notes, and no conclusion. And then the process starts all over again. And of course it gets worse. I'm pretty sure that Mahesh Amelian or Hanif Yusuf do not run their meetings that way. That brings me to the present, and this is where I'm going to end with some thoughts about the future. Now, I think it was 3 years ago I gave an Advocata Institute lecture which I titled Sri Lanka 3 Scenarios for the Future, and I wrote it up subsequently in the Daily FT. And I presented those 3 scenarios, one of takeoff, economic takeoff, one of continued drift, and the third one of relapse into a kind of Rajapaksa government package of illiberal democracy, centralized crony capitalism, China as first friend, and a Sinhala Buddhist first ethnic agenda. Now, as we stand or sit here today, with elections not far away, there's of course no sign in the foreseeable future of that first scenario of takeoff. Rather, I think what Sri Lanka is faced with is a choice between those 2 other scenarios. So what I think is offer in one scenario is continued dysfunction and incompetence, where the role of the state still remains too large and the role for markets too restricted. The other scenario, the other choice, is for relapse, with another decisive shift towards the state and against the market. It is as if Sri Lanka is faced with the choice between Silla and Charybdis, those 2 rocks, or put another way, between the devil and the deep blue sea. There's a saying about Brazil. Brazil is the land of the future, always was and always will be. And very sadly, I think, at least in the short to medium term, that seems to be the prospect for Sri Lanka. I'm sorry to have to end on a note of such foreboding, but my foreboding gets darker when I think of that external environment I painted just a while back. Because an external environment that's heading towards a more potent mercantilism provides cover, not external discipline or exposure or a corrective to continued drift or relapse which we might see in Sri Lanka. And my worry is that institutions in Sri Lanka, public institutions in particular, remain too fragile, more fragile than I think many in the Colombo chattering class appreciate, to withstand such pressure. They are not in good shape to withstand that pressure. Still, and this is where I will truly end, nothing is pre-programmed, nothing is completely predetermined. If I believe that, I would be a hardcore Marxist or a believer in German-style philosophy of history. I am not. I think there are still battles to be fought, non-violent battles, I stress, battles of interests, of ideas, of institutions, of taking advantage of particular situations, even crises, as windows of opportunity. And on that note, I'm going to leave you, I think for the first time in my lecturing history, with a quote from Karl Marx. Karl Marx was one of the most brilliant and also one of the most destructive thinkers of the 19th century. He got the big things wrong on historical materialism, on his 3 iron laws of economics, of his vision of apocalypse morphing into utopia. But in this quote, I think he got the balance about right. And it's from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. It's a famous quote. Man, he says, men make their own history, but they do not make history as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. In other words, there are still choices to be made out there. And as I said, non-violent battles to be fought. Thank you.